This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and today we're completing the limited review for Ikoria Lair of Behemoths. We've already looked at all the monocolored cards in the set, and today we're looking at everything else. The colorless cards, the multicolored cards, and the lands. Even though this video will mark the end of the set review, I'm not done putting out content to get people ready to play this new format. I have a top 10 that probably came out the same day this video did about the biggest bombs, and also I have an archetype guide coming out tomorrow. In addition to that, depending on when you're watching this video, I may actually be streaming Ikoria drafts right now in the early access event on Magic Arena. And if I am, I'll be doing it over on Twitch, so check that out. So in this video, I'm talking about my thoughts on all the colorless, multicolored, and land cards in Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, but I'm only talking about limited. I'm not talking about any other formats, just draft and sealed. I use a letter grade system to sum up what I think about each of these cards. If you're not sure what the letter grades mean, you can find an explanation in the description below. All right, let's talk about our first multicolored card in Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, which is Back for More. So for 4 generic, a black and a green, it's an uncommon instant, and it says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. When you do, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. This seems like a lot of fun. There's so much you can do here. Let's start with the ideal case. Because this is an instant, you can do something nasty, like bring a big boy back from your graveyard who blocks one of their attacking creatures, and also have that creature fight one of their other small creatures. If your creature's big enough to take all that damage, you end up with an amazing deal. So that won't line up all the time, but even if your creature dies from the damage, you still take down 2 things of your opponent's. And then there's also the case where all you can do is kill a single creature with the fight effect, but that's fine too, because if your creature survives, you're still going to get a 2-for-1. So what's the downside? Well, you have to have a creature in your graveyard that is worth fighting with, and the good news is that black-green is all about the graveyard in this set, so setting it up by turn 6 isn't the craziest thing, especially in a world where you can cycle away some beefy creatures early. This just has a ton of power, and even though it's gold, I think you can get away with taking it with the first pick. It's also splashable, and I think that's really nice. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Boneyard Lurker, which for 2 generic, a black and a green, is a 4/4 Nightmare Beast at uncommon. It has Mutate for 2 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana, and that means you can cast it for this alternate cost and then put it over or under target non-human creature you own. They mutate into the creature on top, plus all abilities from under it. And it says, whenever this creature mutates, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a mutate payoff that does help you get around the potential for a 2-for-1. Like all the mutate cards, you can kind of look at it as a split card. It can be a 4-mana 4/4 if that's what you need, which is a good rate in limited anyway, or it makes a creature into a 4/4 that gets you a card from the graveyard. You can also put it under the creature to get the card in a situation where you have a creature bigger than 4/4, but that does seem less ideal mana-wise most of the time. But yeah, getting any permanent back from your graveyard when this mutates is great. It also has hybrid mana, so you don't have to always be locked into black-green to play it. I think this is a nice first pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Brokos, Apex of Forever, who costs 2 generic, a black, a green, and a blue. He's a legendary creature, Nightmare Beast Elemental at Mythic Rare. He's a 6/6, and he has a mutate that costs 1 black-blue hybrid mana, 2 generic mana, and 2 green mana. He's got Trample, and you can cast him from your graveyard using its mutate ability. This guy doesn't stay dead, and I always like that, especially in limited, where that type of resilience is crazy. And sure, you have to have something for it to mutate with, but that isn't a big ask. Usually it will lead to a heavily upgraded creature. Normally you'll be putting Brokos on top to get the 6/6 stats, and then you will of course have any abilities of the cards underneath it, and Trample of course, because Brokos has that, which is pretty sweet. The whole graveyard thing means that you will always be able to drastically upgrade a creature, even from your graveyard. All the Apex creatures have hybrid mana and their mutate cost too, which I think was a really good idea on the part of Wizards, because it means it's easier to play them than it might seem at first glance, as you don't even necessarily have to splash anything, since 2-color decks like blue-green and black-green can pay for the mutate cost. This whole Apex cycle, they're all bombs, they're all incredibly good cards, and Brokos is one of those. It refuses to stay in your graveyard, it will keep causing problems for your opponent all game long, and it has a fail case as a 5-mana 6/6 Trampler that yeah, can also keep coming back from your graveyard as a mutate creature. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Channeled Force, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is an uncommon instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to discard X cards, and target player draws X cards. Channeled Force deals X damage to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker. This is interesting because it's sort of a split card. You can use it just to rummage a bunch, even if you don't have any targets for it, or you can use it to rummage and do some damage. Obviously, the latter is more useful most of the time, but being able to use this on an empty board will matter sometimes. Anyway, I feel like the most common case with this card will be paying 4, discarding a couple of lands, drawing 2 cards, and doing 2 to something. Card selection and damage is nice, but this thing has some serious flaws, namely that you basically never want to cast it early, and most of the time when you use it, you'll just be pitching extra lands, so you have to wait for those to end up in your hand, because a lot of the time it's not going to be worth it to discard real cards. Sure, it's nice that you can use it early to rip through your deck a bit, but I'm not sure that's what I really want to be doing. This card is definitely weird enough that I could see myself being wrong. Maybe it turns out that rummaging and doing 2 to something is way better, but for now, I think this is just a C+. A solid card if you are in blue-red, but not something to pull you into it. Next up, it's Cheville, Bane of Monsters, who for a black and a green is a 1/3 legendary human rogue at Mythic Rare. He's got Death Touch, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if your opponent controls no permanents with bounty counters on them, put a bounty counter on target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. Whenever a permanent an opponent controls with a bounty counter on it dies, you gain 3 life and draw a card. This set has some cool designs as we've seen all week, and this is another one. A 2-mana 1/3 with Death Touch, albeit kind of a hard one to cast since it's 2 colors, would be a passable card anyway, but obviously Cheville does way more than that. He really makes your opponent's life a challenge, since you start bountying their creatures and they have to then think about whether or not it's worth attacking you with a bountied creature, since you gain such an advantage out of the deal. And because Cheville has Death Touch, even if you bounty your opponent's best creature, you could probably take it down. Sure, it might not be as much fun to just trade Cheville right away for their best creature and draw a card and gain some life, but I think frequently that will be the correct play. Making your opponent make those tough decisions will be fun. Cheville is also fairly fragile, but the fact that he only costs 2 mana means it won't kill you for him to die to a removal spell either, and if your opponent's best creature has like flying or something, it isn't going to feel so good, but I think he's a good card, but I don't think he's quite a bomb. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Death's Oasis, which costs white, black, green, the 3 Abzan colors, for an uncommon enchantment. And it says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, then return a creature card with lesser converted mana cost than the creature that died from your graveyard to your hand. And you can pay 1 generic and sacrifice it to gain life equal to the greatest converted mana cost among creatures you control. I'm going to say up front that this is a hard one to judge because it's so weird. So being able to play something that is Abzan colors, especially if green is really your base color, is not going to be that challenging as we saw when we looked at green. So that's something to keep in mind, and this does have the potential to really be a value engine. It mills your library when creatures die and then lets you put a creature from your graveyard into your hand too, assuming that creature had a lesser converted mana cost than the one that died. So the potential problem I see here is setting that up in the early game to actually work out won't be very easy. 2 and 3 mana creatures dying just isn't going to net you a card out of this most of the time. However, in the later part of the game, when your graveyard has several creatures and you're higher up on your curve, that's where this could get pretty interesting. Getting a creature back when your 4-drop trades for theirs will feel amazing. It also has an ability that lets you gain life equal to the highest converted mana cost of creatures you control, and that's kind of a nice thing to have in a world where you just have no graveyard and you have nothing else you can do with it, which will happen sometimes. Sometimes you just need that life. But most of the time, you're really going to want this to stay on the table and be an engine. But yeah, in the early game, I suppose it still mills you and helps you set things up later. But I can see this not doing a whole lot, a little too often, to be psyched up about it. I think I want to start it at a C+. Next up, it's Dire Tactics, which for white and a black mana is an uncommon instant. It says exile target creature. If you don't control a human, you lose life equal to that creature's toughness. Well, exiling a creature for 2 mana is pretty awesome, especially at instant speed, and sure, you might lose some life from it, but in black-white, your deck will have a lot of humans in it. That's really the archetype for black-white, so you may not have to deal with that downside all that often, and even when you are dealing with it, it's still a pretty good card. This is premium removal for sure, and a really good uncommon. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Eerie Ultimatum, which costs 2 white, 3 black, and 2 green for a rare sorcery, and it says return any number of permanent cards with different names from your graveyard to the battlefield. So there's a new cycle of ultimatums in this set, and like last time, they're all super difficult to cast. This time around, the ultimatums all basically win you the game if you can cast them, but the mana cost is not something you can dismiss. This is because the chances that they get stuck in your hand and you can't cast them is fairly high, even in a deck with really good fixing. Having to pay this much colored mana across 3 colors is very difficult. So these are unusual cards to look at. They are bombs when you cast them, but being able to cast them is challenging. As a result, I don't really think I can give them a bomb grade. I think in the end, for Eerie Ultimatum, for example, I want to say that it's a B-. This means that you should not be taking it over premium monocolored removal or some of the more powerful uncommons in the set. Those things are quite powerful, sure, not as powerful as the Ultimatum is in a vacuum, but they're quite powerful and much more likely you play them. That said, I do think taking these relatively highly and speculating on them and trying your hardest to get the fixing you need is a good idea, and it is nice that Eerie Ultimatum at least has some green mana in it, because green, as usual, is the best color at getting all of this fixing so that you can cast an ultimatum to begin with. There are common gain lands in this set, and then there's an uncommon cycle of mana rocks, and there is a lot of fixing in this set, so it will happen sometimes that you can cast it, but I bet it's still more often that you draft one of these and you either aren't able to play it at all, or if you do, you can only cast it like 1 out of 3 times. And so that's what makes this card so weird. You know, in a vacuum, say you cast this in a game, you're probably going to win, but the chances you cast it in a game are not very high, and that's why I think B- is the place to go. Next up, we have Emergent Ultimatum, which for 2 black, 3 green, and 2 blue is a rare sorcery. You search your library for up to 3 monocolored cards with different names and exile them. An opponent chooses one of those cards. Shuffle that card into your library. You may cast the other cards without paying their mana costs. Exile Emergent Ultimatum. So this one lets you get 2 of the 3 best cards remaining in your library and cast them without paying their mana cost. That's usually going to win you the game, though it may not be quite as backbreaking as other ultimatums in some scenarios. 7 mana for 2 cards is usually going to be a great deal, but like all ultimatums, this is hard to cast, and that really has to be reflected in the grade, so this is another B-. It is nice that green is the really big color in this ultimatum, and it may be the easiest one to cast as a result. Next up, it's Frondland Felidar, which for 2 generic, a green and a white is a 3/5 cat beast at rare. It's got Vigilance, and creatures you control with Vigilance have pay 1 mana, tap target creature. This is really good, even on its own. A 4 mana 3/5 with Vigilance would probably already be at least a C+, and then this brings the always very powerful and limited ability to tap down creatures. Being able to attack with this and use that ability is seriously nice, plus your other Vigilance creatures get that upgrade too, and it synergizes with them as well as it does the Felidar. And yeah, the green-white archetype is all about Vigilance, so you'll probably have more of it. This is a nice card. I do think it fits short of being a bomb, but it's close. I'm going to give it a B+. Next up, it's General Kudro of Drannith, who for 1 generic, a black and a white is a 3/3 legendary human soldier at Mythic Rare. Other humans you control get +1/+1, and when he or another human enters the battlefield, exile target card from an opponent's graveyard. You can also pay 2 generic and sacrifice 2 humans to destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. A 3 mana 3/3 human lord that hates on graveyards and large creatures is pretty decent. And the black-white archetype is all about humans, so he's going to fit in quite well there. It's nice that he can function as removal if he needs to. Keep in mind he can sacrifice himself with that ability in a pinch, and that can definitely come up. He isn't super exciting though, even with all the humans around, but he seems like he will be in the lower range of first pickable. Obviously, if you end up with a deck with like 15 humans, he gets way better, but for now, I think he's just a B-. Next up, it's General's Enforcer, who for a black and a white is a 2/3 human soldier at uncommon. Legendary humans you control have indestructible, and you can pay 2 generic, a black and a white to exile a card from a graveyard, and if it was a creature card, you get a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So, a 2 mana 2/3 who can make 1/1 tokens out of stuff in graveyards is a nice card, probably a C+. It is really annoying that this is supposed to be the black-white signpost uncommon, and yet this doesn't have a very good human payoff. There are legendary humans in this set for sure, but not enough for that payoff to be all that good most of the time, since they're all at rare or higher, so mostly, I think we have to ignore that line of text and give it that C+. Next up, it's Genesis Ultimatum, which for 2 green, 3 blue, and 2 red is a rare sorcery, and it says look at the top 5 cards of your library, put any number of permanent cards from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest into your hand. Exile Genesis Ultimatum. The Temur Ultimatum also looks like it will win you the game on the spot since you get to put a bunch of permanents into play for free. There will be times where this whiffs, and that's going to be really annoying because you tried so hard to cast it, but most of the time you'll get 2 to 3 good permanents out of the deal, and that's plenty. Again, as I've said about the other ultimatums, that casting cost is real rough, so I can't go higher than B- here. Next up, it's Illuna, Apex of Wishes, who for 2 generic, a green, a blue, and a red, is a 6/6 legendary beast elemental dinosaur at Mythic Rare. It has Mutate for 3 generic, 1 black-green hybrid mana, and 2 blue mana. It has Flying and Trample, and when it mutates, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land permanent card. Put that card onto the battlefield or into your hand. So if you don't mutate this, it's a 5 mana 6/6 with Flying and Trample. That's a good deal, even if it does ask you for 3 different colors of mana. However, the real power of this card will come from you either casting it for its mutate cost or mutating other stuff onto it, because then it will grab a non-land permanent from your deck and put it into play for free, which is pretty absurd. Mutate does have the danger of devastating you with spot removal when you stack creatures on top of each other, but this mutate trigger completely offsets that. Something to note here too, while you have to be 3 colors if you want to hardcast Illuna, like all the Apexes, you don't need to be 3 colors if you're mutating. Because it has red-green hybrid mana as part of its cost, you can mutate this in a blue-green or red-green deck too that's only playing those 2 colors. And like I said, the real value will come from doing that anyway. Between impressive stats and the amazing mutate trigger, it's hard to imagine Illuna not being a bomb, especially because it's playable in 2-colored decks. She's a bomb. She's going to take over the game with her size or the card advantage she helps you obtain by mutating. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Inspired Ultimatum, which for 2 blue, 3 red, and 2 white is a rare sorcery, and it says target player gains 5 life. Inspired Ultimatum deals 5 damage to any target, then you draw 5 cards. So here you get a 10-point life swing potentially, assuming you hit your opponent, or you can kill a creature and gain 5, and then you draw 5 cards. Yeah, you're going to win that game. Even if you were tapping out for this, and you probably are, the life you gain makes it likely you get to untap and go crazy with all those extra cards, as does potentially being able to kill something with 5 or less toughness. Yet again though, difficult mana cost holds it to a B-. Next up, it's Kinnan, Border Prodigy, who for a blue and a green is a 2/2 human druid at Mythic Rare. Whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced. And there's an activated ability for 5 generic, a green, and a blue, and it says look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a non-human creature card from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So the static ability will come up sometimes in this format. There's a Mana Dork at common, there are some Mana Rocks in this set, but it won't be a regular occurrence. And I think looking at Kinnan independent of that is the thing to do. Without that, he is a grizzly bear with an expensive, albeit powerful, activated ability. It is a great mana sink for you in the late game, and yeah, if you have some mana sources that can get doubled, you'll get there even faster. This basically amounts to Kinnan being fine on turn 2 and being really good in the extreme late game and kind of irrelevant in the middle. I'm kind of unsure of where I want to go here since this is such a weird card, but because most games won't necessarily get to the extreme late game, I don't think I want to be first picking Kinnan. I'm going to give him a C+. Next up, it's Labyrinth Raptor, who for a black and a red is a 2/2 nightmare dinosaur at rare. It's got Menace, and whenever a creature you control with Menace becomes blocked, defending player sacrifices a creature, blocking it. And then, for a black and a red, it can give creatures you control with Menace +1/+0 until end of turn. This is a powerful little 2-drop who is here to support the black-red Menace deck especially. A 2-mana 2/2 Menace is already a solid playable, probably at least a C, but this brings far more to the table. Making your opponent sacrifice one of their creatures, blocking it, means that your opponent has to have a way to do lethal damage to the Raptor with just one of the blocking creatures, making it even more challenging for things to go your opponent's way. Menace is also a keyword ability that appears frequently in this set, including on counters, so that fire-breathing ability will be relevant frequently. I think this is a decent first pick, though not something to take over premium removal necessarily. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Lore Dracus, who for 1 generic, a blue, and a green is a 2/3 lizard beast at uncommon. It has Mutate for 2 blue-red hybrid mana, and when it mutates, you return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So, getting an instant or sorcery back from the yard is a pretty nice mutate trigger and the kind that offsets a 2-for-1. However, spending 2 hybrid red-blue mana to get an instant or sorcery back from your graveyard isn't awesome either, especially when the mutate creature it's attached to is just a 2/3. Normally, all it's going to be doing is that actual effect of letting you get back an instant or sorcery from your graveyard for 2 mana. And sure, if you start mutating multiple times onto this, that's when things can get a little bit silly because it will end up netting you a bunch of cards. But at the same time, you're stacking a bunch of cards onto the Lord Drakis to begin with, which is risky. I really wish they had given Lord Drakis like some random ability other than its mutate trigger, because as it stands, it's pretty disappointing compared to most of the cards in this cycle of gold mutate cards with hybrid mana costs as their mutate cost. But in addition to being able to get you back an instant or sorcery, it's sort of like a split card. He's also a 3 mana 2/3, and having those two options is nice. I still don't think he's great, though. He's definitely not the kind of thing that will pull you into a blue-red deck, but you'll be playing him if you're in a blue-red deck, giving him a C+. Next, it's Narset of the Ancient Way, who for 1 generic, a blue, a red, and a white mana, is a 4/4 legendary planeswalker Narset at Mythic Rare. She starts with 4 loyalty. She has a +1 that says you gain 2 life. Add blue, red, or white mana. Spend this mana only to cast a non-creature spell. She has a -2 that says draw a card, then you may discard a card. When you discard a non-land card this way, Narset of the Ancient Way deals damage equal to that card's converted mana cost to target creature or planeswalker. And she has an ultimate, a -6, that says you get an emblem with, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this spell deals 2 damage to any target. So Narset does not do a great job of protecting herself. She helps you ramp and gain life with that +1, which often won't be the most exciting thing, but it isn't bad either. Although the limitation to non-creature spells is a bit of a bummer. I think most of her value when limited will come from her -2, since looting and doing damage to a creature or planeswalker is pretty nice. Sure, you have to discard a non-land card to get that value, but it will usually be worth it, because you're not spending mana for a removal spell, basically. Her ultimate is actually not the most game-breaking one, as in limited you won't have a ton of non-creature spells most of the time. So yeah, I think you can play her and use her -2 twice, and you're probably doing a pretty good job if that's what you're doing. Keeping her around longer would be nice. I'm just saying she can do that -2 twice, provided you can protect her for a single turn, and that seems doable. In general, I don't like the limitations on her +1 or her -6 a whole lot, as it is hard, even in a spell-heavy deck, to always get value out of those. I don't think Narset is a bomb or even all that close to it, although I do think that you first pick her when you have a somewhat weak pack, but honestly, I think I would take monocolored premium removal and some of the better uncommons in the set over her. Her somewhat challenging mana cost doesn't help either, but yeah, I'm going to give her a B-. Next up, it's Necropanther, which for 1 generic, a black and a white, is a 3/3 cat nightmare. It has mutate for 2 generic and 2 black-white hybrid mana, and when it mutates, you return target creature card with a converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This guy has a cool design. Lots of times in the early game, you won't be able to do anything with that mutate ability, and in those cases, you just play a 3 mana 3/3, and that's pretty nice, and it even has mutate upside later on in the game if you mutate onto it. This is another mutate trigger that makes sure you don't get 2 for 1, and in this case, it brings the card back to the battlefield, which is pretty powerful. Keep in mind, this also has hybrid mana, so you can conceivably play it in a wide variety of color combinations. The black-green deck, for instance, really likes the graveyard, and Necropanther would slide in there well, too. I think Necropanther is first pickable in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Nethroi, Apex of Death, who for 2 generic, a white, a black, and a green, is a 5/5 cat nightmare beast at Mythic Rare, and it has a mutate for 4 generic, a green-white hybrid mana, and 2 black mana. It has Death Touch and Lifelink, and when it mutates, you return any number of target creature cards with total power 10 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This guy has a huge mutate cost, but it's super powerful, so that's probably the right thing to do. Most of the time you mutate this, you'll get somewhere between 2 and 4 permanents back from your graveyard, which is insane. Because it has such an expensive mutate cost, I think you will find yourself casting Nethroi just as a regular creature more frequently than the other Apexes, but that still gives you a 5 mana 5/5 with Death Touch and Lifelink. And if you have other mutate laying around, you can repeat this effect, which will be insane. And obviously, this is the kind of effect that means you're not worried about a 2 for 1 at all, because you just get back a bunch of permanents every time this mutates. Now, you may not always have stuff in your graveyard to get back with the mutate trigger, but usually you will, especially if you're paying it for its mutate cost on turn 7 or whatever. So, like the other Apexes, this is surprisingly easy to cast because of the hybrid mana and its mutate cost. Has a great baseline if you just have to hard cast it, and has an absolutely absurd mutate trigger. And all of that makes this a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Offspring's Revenge, which for 2 generic, a red, a white, and a black is a rare enchantment. And it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, exile target red, white, or black creature card from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 1/1, and it gains haste until your next turn. This seems like fun, but I don't think it'll be that good. There aren't a whole lot of great targets in this set to make into 1/1s. Obviously, the ideal thing here is to have creatures with good into the battlefield abilities and stuff like that, but it just doesn't seem like you'll have a deck with a good enough mix of those, combined with graveyard action most of the time. Black-green is the color combination that will be the best at adding things to your graveyard, and that isn't part of this mana cost. Black is, so you'll be able to do it a little bit, but not as much as I would like. This can get interesting, at least somewhat interesting, in a world where you bring back a creature with a powerful mutate trigger and you have more things to mutate onto it, etc. But I think a lot of the time it's going to be hard to get this going, and getting a 1/1 token every turn off of a 5 mana enchantment is going to feel pretty rough a lot of the time. I don't think I want to play this in the early stages of this format. It's definitely a strange card, one that could turn into an amazing engine, and I could be wrong about, but I'm going to start it at D. Next up, it's Parcel Beast, who for 2 generic, a green and a blue, is a 2/4 elemental beast at uncommon. He has Mutate for a green and a blue, and you can pay 1 generic and tap him to look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield. If you don't put the card onto the battlefield, put it into your hand. So a 4 mana 2/4 with this ability would probably already be at least a B-. The ability only asks for a single mana, and it draws you a card every turn, more or less, whether it's putting a land on the table or actually drawing you a card. That's just the kind of creature who can take a game over with the hand advantage it gives you. Then, of course, you can also mutate with it, and it has a very low mutate cost. Most of the time, the 2/4 body won't be all that desirable, but in the early game, putting this on top for mutate will probably be attractive when you're putting it on a 1 or 2 drop. Later on, just putting this under a big boy will be more ideal, but I think that a significant chunk of the time, you're just going to want to go ahead and hardcast this thing. 4 mana for a 2/4 with this ability will frequently be better than paying 2 mana to give some other creature the ability and no additional bonuses. Obviously, there are mutate triggers, which could make that more attractive. But yeah, even without all the mutate stuff, Parcel Beast is a good card, and I think the added flexibility makes it even better than that. I think this is a great uncommon, one that you shouldn't hesitate to snatch up in many first pick scenarios, giving it a B. Next up, it's Primal Empathy, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue, is an uncommon enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card if you control a creature with the greatest power among creatures on the battlefield. Otherwise, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. Effects that draw you a card every turn are very powerful. It's the kind of card advantage that just becomes insurmountable for your opponent, and sure, you do have to meet a requirement to draw that card, but even if you can't draw a card, a +1/+1 counter every turn is no joke, and obviously it also means that you'll be able to get your creature big enough to start drawing cards with it eventually. Obviously, blue-green is about mutating, getting big boys in play, and this is great incentive for doing it. I think this is another one you can first pick despite being gold, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Quartzwood Crasher, who for 2 generic, 2 red, and a green is a 6/6 dinosaur beast at rare. It has Trample, and whenever one or more creatures you control with Trample deals combat damage to a player, create an XX green dinosaur beast creature token with Trample, where X is the amount of damage those creatures dealt to that player. This seems incredible. Even on its own, it's pretty likely that the Crusher will make a dinosaur when it attacks. As a 5 mana 6/6 with Trample, it has the kind of size that is a real problem. And if you happen to have something with Trample in play the turn you play it, it can actually impact the board right away when that creature attacks. And the red-green archetype is all about Trample, so it's not that far-fetched to imagine that happening. It has a somewhat challenging mana cost, but I think that's worth the risk. This thing will just snowball as more dinosaurs with Trample get made, and it will take over the game. I'm giving this an A. Next up, it's Regal Leosaur, who for a red and a white is a 2/2 dinosaur cat at uncommon. It has a mutate cost of 1 generic and 2 red-white hybrid mana, and when it mutates, other creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. So the mutate trigger here doesn't technically help you avoid a 2-for-1 most of the time, but it is powerful. Pumping your whole team +2/+1 for only 3 mana is a good deal, and if you're going wide, it is usually going to end the game or get close to it. And when you haven't gone wide enough to really take advantage of that, well, you can play this as a 2 mana 2/2 who has some mutate upside for later in the game. I think this will be pretty easy to include in all of your red-white decks, though for now, I don't think I would say that it pulls me into that color pair all on its own. For one thing, red-white is mostly about cycling. There's definitely a little bit of a go-wide theme, but it's not really the main theme for red-white. And as a result, the Leosaur is kind of a weird card to have for that deck. So overall, I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Rielle, the Everwise, who for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a 0/3 legendary human wizard at Mythic Rare. It gets +1/+0 for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. Whenever you discard one or more cards for the first time each turn, draw that many cards. Well, this seems pretty sweet. Even if your deck doesn't have a ton of spells, which is kind of unlikely in blue-red, but even if you don't, there's a chance that Rielle could really shine in your deck. And that's because of her second ability. Keep in mind, when you cycle, part of the cost of doing so is discard a card. That means the first time you cycle each turn with her, you end up drawing 2 cards. So basically, she is both a spell and a cycling build-around, and the most powerful thing to do would be to be able to take advantage of both of those things, but that won't always be super easy. However, I do think ending up with a little bit of support for both things is enough too. As a result, I think Rielle will just be quite good in most blue-red decks who end up with a mix of those things. I think you can take her with a first pick pretty happily. I'm giving her a B. There is a caveat that if your deck has both like 10 cards with cycling and 10 instants and sorceries, she's probably just a straight up bomb, but that's not really going to happen most of the time. Next up, it's Ruinous Ultimatum, which for 2 red, 3 white, and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It says destroy all non-land permanents your opponents control. And here's our last ultimatum, and it is yet another one that will win you the game when you cast it. A one-sided board wipe is no joke, but yet again, it's hard to cast, so I don't want to go above a B-. Next, it's Savai Thundermane, who for a red and a white is a 3/2 elemental cat at uncommon. When you cycle a card, you can pay 2 generic mana, and when you do, Savai Thundermane deals 2 damage to target creature, and you gain 2 life. This is an awesome cycling payoff. Sure, you have to have the mana to spend, but cycling in this set usually costs 1 to 2 mana, so it isn't a stretch to be able to pay the 2, especially in the mid to late game, and when you do, you get to start killing smaller stuff and gaining life, which is pretty awesome. It is nice you get something out of the trigger, even if you can't actually kill their creature. Getting some life no matter what is not too bad. On top of that, it's just a nice aggressive body as a 2 mana 3/2. This is the kind of signpost uncommon that I think is powerful enough to go after early and see if you can make it work. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Skull Prophet, who for a black and a green is a 3/1 human druid at uncommon. It can tap for black or green mana, and you can tap it to put the top 2 cards of your library into the graveyard. Well, between the Thundermane and the Prophet, we've had 2 very impressive signpost uncommons back to back. It may be a little fragile with only 1 toughness, but a creature who ramps and enables graveyard shenanigans is awesome. That's a lot of value for 2 mana, and hey, while 1 toughness might be fragile, 3 power means it can hit pretty hard and trade fairly well, so there's that. I think this is a powerful enough signpost uncommon that I want to take a risk on it early, giving it a B. Next up, it's Sky Cat Sovereign, who for a white and a blue is a 1/1 elemental cat at rare. It's got flying. It gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with flying, and for 2 generic, a blue and a white, it makes a 1/1 white catbird creature token with flying. Well, 2 mana for a 1/1 flyer obviously isn't so good, but this won't usually be a 1/1 flyer for long, and sometimes it will never be one, assuming you have other flyers in play. The thing that really makes this strong is the activated ability. Every time you use it, you're adding 2 additional flying power to the board, and that is definitely the kind of thing that can snowball on your opponent. In the early game, sometimes the Sovereign will be underwhelming and easy to kill, but this is the kind of card that will just end late game board stalls. I don't think you have to give this a build-around grade, since it can do it all on its own, but obviously it is going to be a bit better in a deck with flyers, but if you're in blue-white, that's going to happen even if you aren't really trying. I think this is first pickable despite being monocolored, giving it a B. Next up, it's Slitherwisp, who for 1 blue and 2 black is a 3/2 elemental nightmare at rare. It has flash, and whenever you cast another spell that has flash, you draw a card, and each opponent loses 1 life. This is a silly powerful flash payoff. Making every card with flash draw you a card and do 1 to your opponent is just a crazy good trigger. A 3 mana 3/2 with flash is usually a C or so too, so you have a reasonable floor here. You can flash it in to eat smaller creatures or just to trade, although that latter option doesn't sound super attractive given the power of his ability. Blue-black does have plenty of flash too, that's why this guy is here really. So I think you can expect this to be a C+ in your typical blue-black deck that has like 3 cards with flash, but it has a very high ceiling. If you end up with 6 or 7 cards with flash, this is going to be one of the best cards in your deck and an easy B. I think this means you can first pick this even if it is multicolored with a somewhat difficult casting cost, and even if it is kind of a build-around, just because your fail case is so reasonable and the ceiling is so high. Next, it's Snapdax, Apex of the Hunt, who for 1 generic, a red, a white, and a black is a 3/5 legendary dinosaur cat nightmare. It can mutate for 2 generic and red-black hybrid mana and 2 white mana. It's got double strike, and when it mutates, it deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and you gain 4 life. A 4 mana 3/5 double strike as a fail case isn't too bad, even if it does ask for 3 colors of mana. However, like all of these, he has an easier to cast mutate thanks to hybrid mana, and his mutate trigger lets you do 4 to something and gain 4 life, which certainly offsets the risk of mutating, because you're going to kill something. Plus, putting this on top of the mutation and holding on to the double strike while it gains additional abilities is pretty tempting, and putting it on the bottom to give an even bigger creature double strike is nice too. I think this is a straight bomb, like all the Apexes are. I think he's an A. Next up, it's Song of Creation, which for 1 generic, a green, a blue, and a red, is a rare enchantment, and it says you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Whenever you cast a spell, draw 2 cards. At the beginning of your end step, discard your hand. This is my kind of card. I'm going to have a hard time not first picking this, even though it has kind of a difficult mana cost. That mana cost is offset by the fact that green is one of those colors, and green will have an easy time splashing. Drawing extra cards is super powerful, and this thing will get silly in a hurry. Sure, you won't always want to play it right away since you have other stuff going on in your hand, but once it makes sense to cast this, you will, and you will take over the game. No question about it. Drawing extra cards, playing extra lands, it all goes well together because it makes it more likely you can cast the extra cards you were drawing in the first place. The difficult mana cost might hold it back some, but like I said, green is one of those colors, and I think that's good. I think this gets close to being a bomb. I'm going to give it a B+, and I'm not going to be super surprised to see it go even higher. Next up, it's Sprite Dragon, which for 1 blue and a red is a 1/1 fairy dragon at uncommon. It has flying and haste, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on Sprite Dragon. This seems like a nice build-around for a spell deck, and obviously this is blue-red's thing in this set, as it is in many sets. So getting a counter or 2 on this won't be a challenge. It is also made interesting by the fact that it is great to mutate onto. The +1/+1 counters will stick around on the newly mutated creature, and the other abilities of flying and haste, which won't really matter, but hey, it does gain that too, that'll become part of the mutate creature. Most of the power of this card is in its text box, and that's just going to go well with mutate every single time. So, good with mutate and spells. I think that makes this a signpost uncommon I want to first pick. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Titan's Nest, which for 1 generic, a black, a green, and a blue is a rare enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard. Then you can exile a card from your graveyard, and that adds colorless mana to your mana pool. You can spend this mana only to cast a colored spell without X in its mana cost. So this helps you load your graveyard and can provide you with some really silly mana. There are definitely places to spend silly mana in this format, what with all the behemoths, not to mention some nice mana sinks all around, but I think you will frequently find yourself with a lot of mana and nothing to do with it in Limited. The loading the graveyard part is nice, but this format is not all about the graveyard, even though the black-green deck would probably be okay with this, but a lot of the time this just won't be impactful. I think I'm out on this card for the most part. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Trumpeting Gnar, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue is a 3/3 beast at uncommon. It has mutate for 3 generic and 2 green-blue hybrid mana, and when it mutates, you make a 3/3 green beast creature token. This is alright, but seems kind of underwhelming compared to some of the cards in this cycle. It doesn't bring impressive stats to the table or a keyword ability. You usually want mutate creatures to have one or the other, so it's good with other mutate stuff. So a lot of the time you're going to pay 5 mana for a 3/3 beast and maybe a small upgrade. And mutating it that first time won't feel very special unless you're getting another mutate trigger out of whatever you're mutating it onto, and that is something we have to keep in mind. This does also give you a little bit of a payoff for going really tall on mutating, because you're always going to be able to get that 3/3 green beast creature token every time you do, and of course that offsets some of the dangers. But still, I'm not super excited about this. I don't think it pulls me into blue-green. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Vadrock, Apex of Thunder, which costs one of each Jeskai mana, blue, red, and white. It's a 3/3 legendary creature. It's an elemental dinosaur cat at Mythic Rare. It can mutate for 1 generic, 1 blue-white hybrid mana, and 2 red mana. It has flying and first strike, and when it mutates, you may cast target non-creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. A fail case of a 3 mana 3/3 with flying and first strike is nice, even if it is a somewhat challenging mana cost, but, as I've said, all the Apexes have hybrid mana in their mutate cost, which means to play it, you don't necessarily need to be playing all 3 colors. In this case, he works in red, white, or blue-red. His mutate trigger is powerful too, letting you cast cheap spells from your graveyard, which also offsets any issues you might have with getting 2 for 1 by removal on your mutate creature. The one thing about Vadrock that's kind of disappointing, I think, compared to most of the others in this cycle, is that most of them will be doing something no matter what when you mutate them, but there's no guarantee that you have either cards in your graveyard or non-creature spells in your graveyard that are really worth doing this with, especially because it's only 3 mana or less. So there's going to be times where his mutate trigger is not very useful, and I think that's less true about all of the others in this cycle. Still, he is cheap. He's a 3 mana 3/3 flyer with first strike. If you're mutating him onto things, he's going to give them those nice keyword abilities and things like that. And I still think he's a bomb, but I think Vadrock comes in the lowest of these Apexes. I think he's only an A-. Well, I think all the others are A's. Next up, it's Whirlwind of Thought, which for 1 generic, a blue, a red, and a white is a rare enchantment, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you draw a card. 4 mana for an enchantment that has no immediate impact on the board is always kind of painful and limited, especially because this will continue to not have a big impact on the board unless your deck is loaded up with non-creature spells. And while that's certainly doable, that is a pretty big deck building requirement. This will just be a straight F in most limited decks. You can't play this in a limited deck that only has 3 to 5 non-creature spells. It will be bad. You have to be going big on non-creature spells, and there are other incentives to do that, but I think this still needs a build-around grade. So yeah, it's an F in your typical deck in the format, and a B- in a deck that really gets there. I still don't absolutely love it in a deck with lots of non-creature spells, because it is still expensive and not all that easy to cast for something that takes a while to really impact the game. Next up, it's Winota, Joiner of Forces, who for 2 generic, a red, and a white is a 4/4 human warrior at Mythic Rare. Whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, you look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn. Put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. So for Winota to be at her best, you have to have a nice mix of humans and non-humans in your deck. The good news is this will probably just happen most of the time in this format without really forcing anything, including in red-white. And because you have a 40-card deck and you're looking at the top 6, it isn't even like you have to have a ton of humans. Just 4 or 5 will be nice in a deck loaded up with non-humans that can trigger this. In fact, it is probably better overall to go harder on non-humans than humans if given the choice here. On top of that, this is a 4 mana 4/4, one that sometimes will just come down on turn 4 and allow a non-human to attack and get you an extra creature on the table that is attacking and indestructible. And that's not really a far-fetched scenario at all. That's just assuming you have a 2 or 3 drop that isn't a human. You could potentially curve out with this and really do something silly. Overall, Winota is definitely a bomb, and I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Zenith Flare, which for 2 generic, a red, and a white is an uncommon instant, and it deals X damage to any target, and you gain X life, where X is the number of cards with cycling in your graveyard. Well, this cycling helix is pretty awesome as a cycling payoff. Doing damage to something and gaining life at the same time is always nice. Obviously enough, getting cards with cycling into your graveyard isn't that difficult to make happen, since when you cycle them, they, go to your graveyard. The question becomes, how much cycling do you need for this to be worth it? Probably a decent amount. I think if you have 2 cards in your graveyard, this is somewhat passable, but you probably want 3 before you feel good, and anything above that is awesome. I think your typical deck in this format will have 3 to 5 cards with cycling in them, and I think in a deck like that, the Flare is probably just a D. Getting 2 in your graveyard is doable in those decks, but you shouldn't count on more. If you really get there on cycling though, I'm talking like 10 cards with cycling, Zenith Flare will be one of the best cards in your deck, consistently doing 4 or more. Keep in mind too, this can hit the opponent, and that means this can sometimes just end a game. It is going to be one of your best cards in a deck that really gets there, and I'm giving it a B in that scenario. I think this has a passable floor and a very high ceiling, so taking it with the first pick might not be a bad idea. Our first hybrid mana card is Elite Heedbonder, which costs 1 generic and 2 green-white hybrid mana. It's a 2/4 human scout at uncommon. It has vigilance, and at the beginning of your end step, you gain 1 life for each creature you control with vigilance. So there are 5 archetypes in this set that are based completely around keyword abilities, and the green-white one is all about vigilance, and this is your signpost uncommon for that color pair. The other 5 color pairs that aren't based around keyword abilities generally have more support. Some of them have as many as 3 signpost uncommons. These all only really have 1. Anyway, this one isn't that exciting. A 3 mana 2/4 with vigilance is fine, and so is gaining 1 life every end step, which is what it is when it's alone. The fact you gain more life the more vigilance creatures you have is nice additional upside, but still nothing amazing. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cunning Nightbonder, which for 2 blue-black hybrid mana is a 2/2 human rogue at uncommon. It has flash, and spells with flash you cast cost 1 less to cast and can't be countered. So I would feel fine about playing a 2 mana 2/2 with flash anyway. You can occasionally ambush a more expensive creature with 2 toughness, or a creature with less than 2 power, and it has fine stats. It would probably be a C- if that's all it did, but reducing the cost of spells with flash is nice too, especially because there seems to be a decent amount of it in this set. The blue-black archetype is all about flash. Still, I don't get the feeling that it'll be so much flash in this set that this will be absolutely incredible. It will really just be a decent card, one that you take when it already looks like you're playing blue-black, not one that pulls you into the color pair. I'm giving it a C+. Next up is Fiend Artisan, which for 2 black-green hybrid mana is a 1/1 nightmare at Mythic Rare. It gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard, and you can pay X and then pay a black-green hybrid mana to sacrifice another creature, search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. This guy's interesting. Obviously, he isn't so good in the early game since you are unlikely to have creatures in your graveyard, but by the time you can get even 1 in there, he's still not a bad play as a 2 mana 2/2, especially because in the late game, he can help you tutor up the best creatures in your deck, assuming you're willing to lose a creature in the process. And hey, the creature you lose will actually make the Artisan even bigger, and in theory, the Artisan will just get bigger and bigger as the game goes on anyway. Keep in mind, the activated ability only works at sorcery speed too. I think the whole package here, which might be difficult to make work sometimes, is still worth the first pick a lot of the time. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Gyruda, Doom of Depths, who for 4 generic and 2 blue-black hybrid mana is a 6/6 legendary demon kraken at rare. It has Companion. There's a whole cycle of 10 companions in this set, and they all ask you to fulfill a requirement, and if you fulfill that requirement, they have their own special zone, really your sideboard at the beginning of the game, and you can cast it from that sideboard at any time during the game. In the case of Gyruda, the requirement is that your starting deck contains only cards with even converted mana cost. And when it enters the battlefield, each player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, put a creature card with an even converted mana cost from among those cards onto the battlefield under your control. Making this a companion seems kind of doable and limited, but not usually worth it. You still have access to 2 and 4 drops at least, so it isn't like you'll get run over or anything. But still, I think most of the time you won't be able to make this your companion. However, keep in mind, if you do make something a companion, it's kind of like you're starting the game with an 8-card hand, which is pretty awesome. Anyway, Gyruda makes up for all that difficulty making it a companion by having a very powerful enter the battlefield ability that lets you reanimate an even-costed creature. Note, by the way, that you don't get to choose any cards from the graveyards, which is often how effects like this work. Instead, you have to choose from among the 8 cards total that he mills, the 4 from your opponent and the 4 of your own. But among those 8 cards, it seems pretty unlikely that you're not going to see a creature to get out of the deal. And if you can hit a creature with this, you're going to be in business, even if it's just like a 2/2 or something like that. 6 mana for a 6/6 and a 2/2 is absolutely something you're happy with, and you will frequently get something even bigger. I think Gyruda almost makes it into the bomb range, even if you can't make it a companion, but there will be times where you do whiff on that ability, and I think that holds him back a little bit, but he's still easily first pickable, giving him a B+. Next up, we have Jegantha, the Wellspring, which for 4 generic and a red-green hybrid mana is a 5/5 legendary creature elemental elk. Its companion requirement is that no card in your starting deck has more than 1 of the same mana symbol in its mana cost, and you can tap it to add 1 of each color of mana to your mana pool. This mana can't be spent to cast generic mana costs. So this is a companion that could plausibly end up as a companion in Limited. Sometimes you just end up with a deck in Limited that meets these requirements even if you're not trying, and in general, trying to make this work is probably kind of worth it. It may not be the most powerful card in this cycle for Limited. Its ability to add mana is nice, but not being usable for generic mana makes it difficult to be a great source of mana for mana sinks and stuff like that. So again, it may not be the most powerful, but if you can make it your companion, you're effectively giving yourself an 8-card opening hand, and that advantage is real. I mean, even if you can never use the mana here, you still have a 5-mana 5/5, which is usually good enough for a C or so on its own. Because making this a companion is so real, I think it's actually good enough to be first pickable in some weaker packs, especially because the fail case is passable. Keep in mind too, it can help you splash stuff, so that's some additional upside as well. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Jubilant Skybonder, who for 1 generic and 2 blue-white hybrid mana is a 2/2 human wizard and uncommon. It's got flying, and creatures you control with flying have spells your opponents cast that target this creature cost 2 more to cast. On its own, this gives you a 3-mana 2/2 who is more expensive to kill than most creatures, and since this only costs 3 mana, it will be pretty difficult for your opponent to ever kill this and come out ahead mana-wise. Even something like Shock would cost 3 mana. Of course, it also gives this effect to all of your other flyers, and that's some nice additional upside. The blue-white deck is all about flyers, but I'm still not really in on this as a card that will pull me into the color pair and make me want to build a flying deck. I think it's just something you'll take when it turns out you already have a bunch of flyers, and I think that means it's a pretty solid card, but not one you want to first pick. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Kaheera, the Orphan Guard, who for 1 generic and 2 green-white hybrid mana is a 3/2 legendary cat beast at rare. Its companion requirement is that each creature card in your starting deck is a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast card. It has vigilance, and each other creature you control that's a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast gets +1/+1 and has vigilance. This is a companion requirement that is kind of doable, I think, given the number of creatures with these types. However, it won't be super easy. That said, even without the companion requirement being fulfilled, this is a good card. A 3-mana 3/2 with vigilance is already passable, but the real value of this card comes from its Lord effect. Even if it is difficult to successfully build your deck with only creatures of that type, your deck is going to have enough creatures with those types that the Orphan Guard will be pumping and giving vigilance to a good chunk of creatures in your deck. Even if you really don't try to take things with these creature types, it will just happen naturally. For that reason, I think Kaheera is a B, and something you can first pick easily. Don't try super hard to make sure that you manage the companion effect, but again, it is doable. Next up, it's Keruga, the Macro Sage, who for 3 generic and 2 green-blue hybrid mana is a 5/4 legendary dinosaur hippo at rare. Its companion requirement is that your starting deck contains only cards with converted mana cost 3 or greater and land cards. When Keruga the Macro Sage enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other permanent you control with converted mana cost 3 or greater. I don't think this companion mechanic is one you can reliably build around in Limited, though it will depend on the speed of this format, and this one might be really slow with all the big monsters running around, but generally not running anything that costs less than 3 is dangerous, even if you do essentially get an 8th card in your opening hand in Keruga. Still, Keruga has a powerful enter the battlefield trigger even if you take the companion part out of the equation. It isn't a stretch to think that this will frequently be a 5-mana 5/4 that draws you a card. Sure, sometimes it won't, but other times it will draw you 2 to 4 cards or maybe even more. The fact that this is a 5/4 makes the fail case not seem too bad either, but yeah, this will usually at least be a 2-for-1, and while I don't quite think that's bomb territory, you will first pick this a lot. I'm giving it a B. It's nice that the companions are all kind of cool cards because of the companion mechanic, but they're all pretty good even if you can't pull off the companion requirement, so they'll be fun and limited either way. Next up, it's Lurrus of the Dream Den, which costs 1 generic and 2 white-black hybrid mana. It's a legendary cat nightmare at rare. Its companion requirement is that each permanent card in your starting deck has converted mana cost 2 or less. It has lifelink, and during each of your turns, you may cast 1 permanent spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. So a 3-mana 3/2 with lifelink is usually a C, but this does a lot more. Now, don't expect to ever succeed in pulling off the companion requirement here in Limited. I wouldn't advise making your deck only have 1 and 2 mana cards in it just for this, because you will end up getting overpowered. However, this is fine even in the complete absence of companion, like all of these are. Most decks will have enough 1 and 2 mana things in them that Lurrus helping you cast 1 or 2 of those from your graveyard is not far-fetched, and the fail case here is perfectly fine. So yeah, I think I would feel okay spending an early pick on this in some of the weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Lutri, the Spell Chaser, who for 1 generic and 2 blue-red hybrid mana is a 3/2 legendary elemental otter at rare. He's a companion, and his companion requirement is that each non-land card in your starting deck has a different name. He has Flash, and when he enters the battlefield, if you cast it, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Now this is a companion effect that will be doable in Limited. It's the most doable one of all of them in Limited. Frequently, you don't end up with any multiples in Limited anyway, and if you do have multiples, it isn't that hard or damaging to your deck to cut everything down to 1 in most cases, especially when the payoff is having this in a special zone from the start of the game. A 3-mana 3/2 with Flash would normally be a C, but between that companion effect and the enter the battlefield trigger, you're going to be getting a lot more than that out of it. Sure, costing 3 means it won't be very effective at copying spells in the super early game or anything, but casting a 1 or 2 mana removal spell and then copying it with this isn't far-fetched at all, especially if it's always a companion. And sure, the downside is your opponent knows this Flash creature is coming if you have it as your companion, but I'm okay with that. I think this is a nice card that you will first pick frequently. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Obosh, the Prey Piercer, who for 3 generic and 2 black-red hybrid mana is a 3/4 legendary Hellion Horror at rare, and it's a companion. In this case, your starting deck has to contain only cards with odd converted mana costs and land cards. If a source you control with an odd converted mana cost would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. So this is another companion card that I think we mostly have to look at on its own, because actually pulling off this requirement is challenging. Here, you get a 5-mana 3/5 that is effectively a 5-mana 6/5, who also doubles the damage of your other odd permanents. That means oftentimes it will come down and alter the board right away, assuming you have some permanents that have some odd mana costs already. But yeah, the companion requirement is tricky here. Skipping 2 drops is not usually a good idea, and I don't really think it is quite powerful enough to really warrant going all in on that. It is good, don't get me wrong, but I think it's only in the lower range of first pickable. I'm giving it a B-. Next, it's Proud Wildbonder, who for 2 generic and 2 red-green hybrid mana is a 4/3 human warrior at uncommon. He's got Trample, and creatures you control with Trample have. You may have this creature assign its combat damage as though it weren't blocked. A 4-mana 4/3 with Trample is already pretty nice, and the fact that he can do 4 no matter how he gets blocked is a nice upgrade, especially because he does it for all your Tramplers. He obviously gets better the more Trample you have, and I like that if you have Trample on the table already, he will have an immediate impact the turn you cast him. The red-green archetype is all about Trample, too, so he's going to be good there. I think he's worth first picking in some weaker packs. I'm giving him a B-. Next up, it's Sonorous Howlbonder, which for 1 generic and 2 black-red hybrid mana is a 2/2 human warrior at uncommon. It's got Menace, and each creature you control with Menace can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. So on its own, this has Super Menace, and that's a pretty good evasive ability. 3 creatures being able to block this just won't be the case a decent chunk of the time, and it will be effectively unblockable in a lot of scenarios, and it grants this bonus to all your other Menace creatures, and obviously the red-black deck is all about Menace. I think you can first pick this one in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Umori, the Collector, who for 2 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana is a 4/5 legendary ooze at rare. It's a companion, and its requirement is that each non-land card in your starting deck shares a card type. And as Umori the Collector enters the battlefield, you choose a card type, and spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 to cast. This is another companion effect that's a little tricky to pull off in Limited, but this is one that if you really wanted to do it, you probably could. Just stuff your deck filled with creatures, and sometimes maybe that happens. So it's not something that's like impossible like some of these companions. It's doable. It will probably weaken your deck, but if you have like 2 non-creatures in your deck and you have Umori, you might want to think about maybe just cutting those 2 cards and getting him basically as your 8th card in your opening hand that happens to be a 4-mana 4/5 that will reduce the cost of every permanent in your deck because your whole deck's going to be creatures. Still, it's not one that you're going to pull off all the time or anything like that. But even if he's just a 4-mana 4/5 with this ability, he's a good card, even one you're willing to first pick pretty regularly. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Yorion, Sky Nomad, who for 3 generic and 2 blue-white mana is a 4/5 legendary bird serpent at rare. It's another companion, and its requirement is that your starting deck contains at least 20 cards more than the minimum deck size. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile any number of other non-land permanents you own and control. Return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So, this companion requirement is not one you should fulfill in Limited. Technically you can, but running 60 cards is a huge problem for your deck as it will make your deck both less consistent and less powerful. That said, like all the companions, Yorion is good anyway. A 5-mana 4/5 flyer is probably already a B, and it has a very nice Enter the Battlefield trigger that can do a number of things. It can give you another trigger from an Enter the Battlefield trigger from another creature, break up a stack of mutate creatures if you feel like you want to go wide with them now, get an aura removal spell off of one of your creatures, and even just make it so all your creatures untap. The Enter the Battlefield trigger will do very little, a decent chunk of the time, but when it does have a real impact, it will be awesome. And that all comes on a 5-mana 4/5 flyer. And I think all of that packaged together, even though you're never going to companion with this, makes this a bomb. I think it's an A-. Next up, it's Zirda the Dawnwaker. Costs 1 generic and 2 red-white hybrid mana. It's a 3/3 legendary elemental fox at rare. Its companion says that each permanent card in your starting deck has an activated ability, and abilities you activate that aren't mana abilities cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it, and target creature can't block this turn. Our last companion is similar to the others. This is one that's near impossible to make a companion in your limited deck, though maybe not completely impossible, but it's very, 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 very unlikely. We can just disregard the companion here. Instead, what you have here is a 3-mana 3/3 that reduces the cost of activated abilities and has a nice activated ability that makes something unable to block. Keep in mind, by the way, that the activated ability part does apply to cycling, so your cycling cost can be reduced down to 1 mana. That all makes this very good, even without companion, and one that you can first pick pretty confidently, giving it a B. Alright, now we're going to move into colorless cards, where our first one is Adaptive Shimmerer, who costs 5 mana for a 0/0 common insect with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, it does so with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. A 5-mana 3/3 with flash is not a good card. It's one that you would almost never play. Now, there are a couple of things here that make it a little better than it might be in most formats. One of these is Mutate. Mutating onto this means you get to have the counters and thus have an even larger Mutate creature. The other thing is that flash is in the blue-black archetype, so maybe it fits there too. I still don't like this very much though. It's inefficient, and even if it is nice to mutate onto, I have a hard time really getting behind that. I don't want to go above a D here. Next up, it's Farfinder, who for 3 generic is a 1/1 fox at common. It has vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. We've seen cards like Skittering Surveyor and Pilgrim's Eye be really nice sources of fixing in the past, and this set is of course a wedge set, where splashing a third color and even straight up playing a third color will happen a decent chunk of the time. On top of that, this is not the worst thing to mutate on top of, since it at least gives your new monster the vigilance keyword. So I don't think you generally want to take this with a first pick ever, but it is the kind of card that will become increasingly valuable the more demanding your mana needs are. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Mysterious Egg, which is 1 generic mana for a 0/2 egg at common, and when it mutates, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. I don't like this a whole lot. The flavor is cool, but I feel like you'd rather have a more exciting ability for mutate and a more exciting fail case than a 1 mana 0/2. I can see maybe some games getting really out of hand if somebody plays one of the 2 or 3 mana mutate creatures on a Mysterious Egg. That might be pretty interesting, but I don't think I want to play this in most decks. I don't want to go all in on something like Mysterious Egg early that, it doesn't have a great fail case and it doesn't do anything to offset the risk of getting 2 for 1, and all of that I think makes this a D. All right, now let's move to the artifacts. These 3 cards, by the way, not artifacts, just colorless cards. Our first artifact is Crystalline Giant, who for 3 generic is a 3/3 artifact giant. He's rare, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, you choose a kind of counter at random that Crystalline Giant doesn't have on it from among Flying, First Strike, Death Touch, Hexproof, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, Vigilance, and +1/+1. Put a counter of that kind on Crystalline Giant. This seems really good. A 3-mana 3/3 that gains a random ability keyword or +1/+1 counter each combat is pretty nice. I also like that it makes sure it doesn't ever give you double of the keyword counters, which would obviously be useless. So, if left out long enough, the Giant becomes a 4/4 with all those keyword abilities. That isn't ultra likely or anything, but just getting more and more powerful every turn is pretty nice, and it's colorless, so you know you'll want to play this and can play it 100% of the time. I'm going to start it at B+. I don't quite want to say it's a bomb because it leaves so much up to chance. Next, let's look at all the crystals. So there's a crystal for each of the wedges in this set, and they all are 3 mana uncommon artifacts that you can tap to add one of those 3 wedge colors, and they all have cycling for 2. These are all pretty nice. Normally, 3 mana rocks that produce 3 colors are a bit suspect. They're just kind of slow and don't add to the board in any real way. They're usually something like a D+. You run them if you need fixing, but you hope you don't have to. However, if you add cycling to pretty much anything, as we've been saying all week, it is substantially better. Sometimes you really don't need one of these crystals. You need to hit a land drop or find something more impactful, and cycling them away gives you a way to do that. Of course, this set also has cycling payoffs, and this fits nicely there too. I think these are all going to be solid pieces of fixing. I'm giving them all a C. Next up, it's the Ozolith, which for 1 generic mana is a legendary artifact at rare. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may remove all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. This is a cool design. I think it's probably something that won't work in every deck though. There are keyword counters in this set, but you have to have the Ozolith actually doing something a significant chunk of the time to make it worth a card, and doing that is not, I don't think, a foregone conclusion. Saving those counters and putting them on another creature later is a cool effect and could certainly help you win some games. I think I want to say though that this is a D in your typical deck in this format, and I have a hard time imagining a deck that can really abuse the Ozolith in this set. It's just, you have to have, first of all, you have to get the Ozolith in play, which isn't that hard at 1 mana, but it has to be in play when your creatures that happen to have +1/+1 counters and keyword abilities die to really take advantage of it. You can draw it in the late game and it will be near useless sometimes. And you also need those creatures to die, by the way, for them to get tokens, counters onto the Ozolith in the first place. I mean, all of this is not impossible, but it seems like a lot of hoops to jump through. I think the ceiling here is only a C+. Next up, it's Sleeper Dart, which for 2 generic mana is a common artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you can tap it, and target creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. You also have to sacrifice it, by the way. So this replaces itself, and that makes a card more reasonable, but what it does is just so underwhelming most of the time. It doesn't even tap the creature down. That means that the creature has to be already tapped for this to actually do anything. And sure, sometimes locking a creature down with this will be good, and it may make your opponent play a bit differently when they know it's in play. But I still don't think I'm going to be playing this most of the time unless my draft went really badly, giving it a D-. Next up, it's Springjaw Trap, which for 1 generic mana is a common artifact with flash, and you can pay 4 and tap it and sacrifice it, and it deals 3 damage to any target. Usually, when we see this artifact-based removal, it is what you end up running when you're super desperate for removal, and I think that's largely what we have here. Paying a total of 5 mana to do 3 to something is not a good rate, not even close to a good rate, really. You do get to pay the mana over the course of a couple turns, and it does have flash, so sometimes you'll be able to use this like you would an instant speed removal spell and surprise your opponent, but the efficiency is still pretty terrible. And yeah, the blue-black flash deck is a thing, and maybe it makes the cut there more, but I still think this is just a D+. Alright, that's it for colorless cards and artifacts. Let's move now to the lands. So, first up on the lands, there's the whole cycle of gain lands at common. They all add 2 mana. All 10 of them add a different combination of 2 mana, and they all enter the battlefield tapped, and when they do, you gain 1 life. So, common dual lands are nice to have around, as they make splashing really easy and going full 3 colors actually doable. I think that you should be taking these lands, especially if they overlap with 1 or more of your colors, over most cards that are a C or lower, as having great mana in this set will enable you to play more powerful cards that are 2 or 3 colors or that you're splashing and so forth. That means I'm giving all of these a C+. Next up, there's Bonder's Enclave, which is a rare land. You can tap it for colorless mana, and you can pay 3 and tap it to draw a card. Activate this ability only if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. I usually love little utility lands like this. In the early game, it just functions as a land that can help you add mana to your mana pool the way all lands do, but then in the late game, it can turn into a card advantage engine. You do have to have a reasonably large card to use that ability, a reasonably large creature to use that ability, but getting that going in the later part of the game is not far-fetched. This is going to be able to draw you a card in a lot of different games, and probably more than once. It's a good mana sink to have around. The one downside about it, of course, is that it's not so good for your mana base. If you're playing this, it might be a little challenging to go more than 2 colors, and going 2 colors will be fine, but there will be lots of opportunities in this set to at least splash a 3rd color, and if you're running the Enclave, you probably can't get away with that, because it's a land that just adds colorless mana. It doesn't help you fix or anything like that. Now, you could maybe think of it as an 18th land so that you can still manage to splash and sort of treat it like it's a mana rock that does something later in the game. A mana rock that costs 0. I don't know. You could think of it that way. But still, it does have those downsides. But even with those downsides, I think you generally want to be taking this relatively early, and I think it's even first pickable in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Evolving Wilds, a common land that you tap and sacrifice to search your library for a basic land card. You put it onto the battlefield tapped and then shuffle your library. This is another common source of fixing, and it's always a nice one. It allows you to splash a color off of a single non-basic land, and that tends to be really good for your mana. Like the gain lands, I recommend taking Evolving Wilds over most cards that are a C or lower, which means this is another C+. And finally, our last cards in this video, our last cards in this set review, are the Triome lands. There's a whole cycle of them. They all each represent one of the triomes, one of the wedges in this set. And they all have 3 basic land types that reflect the colors of mana that it can add. They're all rare, and so they're all really good sources of fixing because they add 3 different colors of mana, and they have cycling for 3 mana. So these provide amazing fixing. They're better than the other lands in the set at fixing, and the fact they have cycling is nice too, since if you draw this late and already have all the mana you need, you can cycle it away, basically giving you some flood insurance. I don't think you'll ever end up with a pack one, pick one that is so weak you want to take one of these, but it's going to be close. And if you find yourself in a 3-color deck or splashing, you should certainly start valuing the Triomes accordingly, but I think I'm going to start them at C+ in this format. Alright, so that is the end of this set review, but it is not the end of Ikoria Lair of Behemoth's limited content. I'll be back tomorrow with an archetype guide talking about what each of the 2 color pair combinations want to do, the key cards for them, and things like that. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch upcoming Ikoria limited content, don't forget to subscribe. If there's anything you disagree with me about in this video, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.